Our next witness is, and I'm going to have to work with me on the pronunciation, Tendayi Achiume. If I'm wrong, I apologize. She is a professor of law at UCLA and the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Her work focuses on the global governance of racism and xenophobia and the legal and ethical implications of colonialism for contemporary international migration. More generally, her research and teaching interests lie in international human rights law, international refugee law, international migration, and property. She earned her JD and her BA from Yale University, and then moved on to the sunny Southern California. Professor, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Congresspersons, it's a privilege to address you today. I'm a professor of law at UCLA School of Law, where I'm a core faculty member of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and the Critical Race Studies program. And my areas of expertise include international human rights law and the global governance of racism. I'm also the United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. In this role, I'm an independent expert who's appointed to provide counsel to UN member states regarding, among other things, the meaning of their obligations under international human rights law to combat racism, racial discrimination, and to promote racial equality. My testimony today is drawn to a great extent from a report I presented to the United Nations General Assembly in 2019 on the urgency of reparations for racial discrimination rooted in transatlantic slavery and colonialism. International law recognizes reparations as necessary for rectifying wrongful acts and providing accountability for human rights violations. Within the international legal system, reparations entail a specific framework and responses, which I describe in full in my written testimony. But briefly, within the system, reparations are defined broadly to require restitution, compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. Popular conceptions of reparations are often fairly narrow, focusing only on financial compensation. But by contrast, the international system places emphasis on a more comprehensive approach, according to which financial compensation may certainly be necessary but not sufficient. Other required measures may include transforming the political, economic, and social institutions and mechanisms for disclosing truth and restoring dignity for those subject to racial subordination resulting from legacies of enslavement. Notably, general measures such as social welfare programs that benefit racially subordinated groups, including people of African descent, that are pursued in the ordinary conduct of government are not a substitute for reparations. Fulfillment of state reparative responsibilities requires tailored interventions that are rooted in acknowledgement of the underlying harm of violations these interventions seek to remedy. In the context of racial discrimination rooted in slavery, reparations address two sets of human rights. First, the historic racial injustices of slavery that remain largely unaccounted for today. And second, the contemporary racially discriminatory effects of structures of inequality and subordination that have resulted from failures to redress the racism of slavery and of colonialism. There's broad consensus in the international community that the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in general did not terminate the racially discriminatory structures built by those practices. And the consensus is that transatlantic slavery and colonialism remain among the root causes of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance against Africans and people of African descent. As a result, in addition to implicating individual wrongful acts in the past, reparations for slavery implicate entire legal, economic, social, and political structures that enabled slavery and which continue to sustain racial discrimination and inequality today. This means that the urgent project of providing reparations for slavery requires governments not only to fulfill remedial obligations resulting from specific historic wrongful acts, but also to transform contemporary structures of racial injustice and of inequality and discrimination that are the product of centuries of slavery. National commissions, such as those proposed by HR 40, are well positioned to tailor recommendations to the specific legal contexts which sustain racial inequality. In the United States, the history of transatlantic slavery has left an indelible mark. the continued presence of racism, racial discrimination, ideologies of racial superiority in U.S. legal, political, social, and economic structures underscores the interconnection between the historical wrongs of slavery and contemporary injustices. I've joined other UN experts in noting that reparations are not just useful mechanisms for fulfilling moral or political obligations. Rather, reparations for slavery are an integral part of fulfilling the international legal mandate to eliminate racial discrimination. The United States is not exempt from these responsibilities, and HR 40 would represent important progress in fulfilling its obligations under international law. Reparations for racial discrimination rooted in the transatlantic slave trade have proven controversial in the countries that bear the greatest responsibility for the associated violation. In cases where states have pursued reparations for slavery and colonialism, they have done so in racially discriminatory ways. Notable historical examples exist where whites who have profited and benefited for the most from chattel slavery and colonialism received monetary compensation, while non-whites in their nations were partially or wholly left without redress. The Reparations Commission proposed by HR 40 presents an opportunity for the United States to show international leadership on what can be achieved when sufficient political will exists to remedy historic and persisting racial injustice associated with the enslavement of people of African descent. Among the most significant barriers to the pursuit of reparations for people of African descent in the United States and elsewhere is the absence of comprehensive accounting of the harms of slavery, and the Reparations Commission would provide the foundation for this accounting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate your lifelong studies and your work and your passion and your participation. Our next witness is Kathy